Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much indeed for finding me. It's a crowded world out there in YouTube, and if you're new to my channel, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any equipment, basically indoors or outdoors or not at all. We all struggle to find the right orchids for us and the right information, which is kind of why I started my channel, because I just found it really hard to find intel for my growing conditions. So for better or for worse, here I am. And I do post every Friday, so hit subscribe if you want to follow my amateur stumblings through the world of growing orchids. And today, plant lovers, literally an amateur stumbling perhaps, we are going to look at some of my Phalaenopsis that need a repot. And I think it's fair to say that the humble phal, as they're known, is perhaps a gateway orchid. It tends to be often the first orchid anyone's given. They're often given as gifts instead of cut flowers, or as thank you gifts for hosting someone for something. You can literally find them everywhere in the world, in every season, in bloom, in garages and hardware stores and florists and supermarkets. You might be tempted to rescue the odd one looking very sad and disheveled in hardware stores and supermarkets, as I have done, which means you end up with a ton of white phals. But nonetheless, it is a beautiful, beautiful orchid and relatively tough, relatively forgiving, and relatively easy to get to flower. So I have got two, not this one. This is going to be our show and tell specimen. I've got two that need to be repotted. This one, which I bought over a year ago, and I made a video actually. I bought it from a place in Melbourne called Collector's Corner. Very healthy, and it is still in the container that I bought it in, which is actually a plastic pot within a plastic pot. And very healthy it's looking too. It's growing in 100% sphagnum moss, but it's in plastic. I think it's time for me to repot it. And as you can see from the flower spike, it is dead. So we're also going to trim. Many a tale to tell about trimming your Phalaenopsis stem, but we'll get to that when we get to this orchid in particular. It's a no ID, but it has a beautiful white flower with a pink lip. Now the other phal to show you, you can actually see the dire straits of this one here. I'm actually not going to take it out until I've spun the camera around and I've got my potting tray out. But this one I bought at the same time, has the most beautiful flowers, and plant lovers, I've just left it in a corner like that character from Dirty Dancing. Watered it, you know, fed it occasionally, and it really needs to be repotted because it's literally falling out of its pot. A lot of the roots are dead. We'll have to see if this one is going to survive and prosper. It looks very healthy from the top. Anyway, we'll get to this one as well when I turn the camera around and I'm ready to repot. So perhaps just a recap of our Phalaenopsis friends. A very, very commonly found orchid, easy-ish to grow as long as you get a couple of basic things right, and super common. So Phalaenopsis, commonly known as the moth orchid, and for very good reason. Now I'm going to drop in some footage of mine and this one in flower so you can see the flowers, but I'm sure you all know what they look like. And the ones we're talking about here today are hybrids. So these are the ones that have been produced over, well, at least a century now, I imagine, to produce regular flowers, large flower size, different flowered colors, etc., 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 although originating from their species ancestors, which is a group of orchids that is found from India all the way across Southeast Asia and actually down into the tip of Australia, into the tropical north of Australia. There's a fantastic species of Phalaenopsis here actually, which has beautiful white flowers. Surprise, surprise. Which I don't have because it is a far north orchid, which means it comes from a very tropical environment. But we'll get to environment in a minute. Needless to say though, Phalaenopsis have quite a wide distribution, so there are lots of different species that your hybrid may have drawn its ancestral roots from. And often hybridization just means that the sort of growing conditions for a plant become a little easier, and we will also get to that as well. But these plants aren't the high maintenance tropical plant that you might imagine given where they come from. So the name Phalaenopsis, surprise, surprise, comes from Greek, and the prefix comes from phalania, which is Greek, meaning like a moth. And then the opsis bit, the suffix opsis, means like, moth-like. Ta-da! Moth orchids, there you go. Don't you just love taxonomy? Now, they were described in 1825, so they've sort of been around in cultivation for quite a while in comparison to some other orchid types. And in the wild, they are an epiphyte. Now, many orchids are epiphytes, but there are epiphytes and there are epiphytes and there are epiphytes. But essentially, the word epiphyte means that the plant is living on something. It doesn't have its roots in the soil. But there are lots of ways that a plant can have its roots on something. So in the case of Phalaenopsis, they literally cling. So they have lots of aerial roots, as you can see from this beast here. You see all these roots dangling about here, and they literally anchor the plant to the tree. So if you see pictures of them in the wild, they're often on mossy branches or tree trunks. The plant is sort of sitting on it. The roots cling on like an octopus. And perhaps some moss might build up around the base of the orchid and a little bit of detritus, but not a huge amount. So this is a real clinger, and you can often see them on the sides of a trunk, so it's quite vertical, which gives you a bit of an indication about how to look after it. So you imagine you've got your orchid literally like that on the side of a tree or on a branch, which means that the leaves are kind of perfectly designed for the water to run away, not down into the ground. Now, when I first started growing Phalaenopsis, you will laugh at this, I thought, a bit like a bromeliad, it must love having water in the crown because it will just absorb it and it'll run down. Oh, no, 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 no. What happens then, plant lovers, particularly if it's cold, is that you'll essentially rot the crown of the orchid. So these orchids are kind of ergonomically designed in the wild that the water runs down, runs on the roots and passes across the plant really quickly. So it dries out fairly quickly as well. Wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. They're in very humid, cloudy environments generally, so there's plenty of airborne moisture for these aerial roots to absorb. But it is certainly not sitting in a damp spot, and it certainly isn't collecting water in the crown as I mistakenly thought in my misspent orchid youth. So first rule of thumb, don't let water sit in there, particularly in winter, because the rot, it's like the plague, will happen very, very quickly, literally overnight. It's remarkable how these pathogens are in the air and they zone in like a mosquito in summer. But then the other thing about phals is that these have been hybridizers, as I said, over years. So they can basically take the same conditions you can. So they're not a super touchy tropical plant. And I don't have a huge amount of success with tropical plants because I find them prone to mites and they like too much humidity, or I don't know. Anyway, I'm just not really great with tropical plants. Phalaenopsis, although you think they might be, kind of aren't. They really like the same conditions you do. Not too cold, relatively humid, and enough water. But I've made a million Phalaenopsis videos, so I'll link the playlist below. But in a nutshell, I tend to let mine dry out reasonably between each watering. Not completely, because the leaves will start to show signs of dehydration, but not something to keep wringing wet, but sort of on the moister side, but allowed to dry out in between that moistness, if that makes any sense. Growing them in sphagnum, pure sphagnum moss, does enable you to keep track of the moisture level because the moss will look to the eye very dry very quickly, and you'll know when the plant needs to be watered. The temperature thing is quite important. So although these species plants come from the tropics, the household plant can deal with your own home conditions, but they do need that seasonal change in temperature to trigger blooming. So they should bloom once a year, and the way that commercial growers trigger these plants to bloom whenever they want, so there's always a Phalaenopsis in bloom every day somewhere in the world, is that they chill them. And that doesn't mean putting them in the fridge, but they respond to that sort of summer to autumn chill. And it's often just a few degrees difference that the temperature drops at night, and that triggers the plant into its blooming phase. And here in Melbourne, the flower spikes are generally triggered in sort of late autumn, winter. The flower spike grows and it takes quite a long time to mature. And then by late spring, summer, your flowers will start to open. So that coolness is actually quite important. And if you are in a house where it's quite warm in winter, i.e. you've got great heating, you might want to put your Phalaenopsis on a windowsill quite close to the glass so that the chill from the glass will actually sort of chill the plant at night while the ambient temperature can still be quite warm. And when I lived in New York for many years, that's what I did with my phal. Sat on the kitchen windowsill. The glass got really cold in winter, but the apartment was still warm enough not to kill the plant, and it bloomed without fail every year. And that then brings us cunningly to light. They are described as low light orchids, and the leaves will burn very quickly. They'll get black spots if there is too much direct sunlight. But I would err on the side of slightly more indirect light than shady indirect light, if you know what I mean. So if you've got a window with a curtain, pull it back a little bit, but not too far into the room. If you've got diffused light, then that is perfect, but it does need to be relatively bright, I find. Okay, potting now. Many ways to skin a cat, as they say, which is an awful phrase. I shan't say that again. Wherever you are in the world and whatever your conditions, people will pot and grow Phalaenopsis in whatever suits them, really. Whenever you buy them in Australia, though, and I'm sure this might be the same around the world, like this one, you tend to find them in plastic little slip pots like this in 100% sphagnum moss. And I have also found them in glass vessels with no drainage in 100% sphagnum moss. And Exhibit A, this is how I pot some of mine. Potting is perhaps the wrong word, because this is literally a vase, a glass vase with no drainage, which kind of goes against the cardinal rule of all potted plants, which is it must be free draining, particularly with an epiphytic orchid. Well, this I have been growing for years, and this orchid I have made many a video about. This is the one that I was debating whether or not to chop the flower spike, which I ended up doing, and there's the stump just there. I chopped it off not that long ago, actually. It just started to get really unwieldy. Obviously, the thing about growing something like this is that you do not want water to be settling in the bottom and essentially rotting the moss and rotting the plant. So a bit like a plastic pot, this gives you a great indication of how your watering regime is going. You can see how dry it is at the top and how green and moist it is at the bottom. This orchid seems really happy. The moss hasn't rotted and deteriorated, it doesn't smell, and this blooms for me very easily. I would just say though, this is perhaps not the optimum way to pot anything. I kind of do it out of habit with some of my phals now, and I'm going to pot one of these in this manner. The other thing obviously is to bear in mind that if you get direct sun onto this glass, it's going to heat up really quickly, become a little greenhouse, and perhaps burn the roots. So you really want to make sure that this is not in direct light, any direct light, if you're going to be perhaps foolhardy enough to grow your orchids like this. Okay, well, I'm going to spin the camera around, and we're going to pot one of these in a glass vessel, and we're going to pot one of these. Oh, I've got to show you the pot that I'm going to pot the other one in. I completely forgot I bought it. Look at this. This is a pot unboxing video suddenly. Friends of mine have an antique business, and I was down there and I saw this and thought, oh my goodness, my life is not complete. Let me unwrap it. It is a 19th century French ceramic flower pot. But look at that. Isn't that wonderful? But what is even more delightful, yes, it has a hole in the bottom. It has a saucer that has survived. So let me just open that for you. There we are. Look at that. And there is the maker's mark on the bottom, which may or may not interest you. Depends if you're into French 19th century ceramics. But anyway, there's our saucer, there is our pot, and is that not the perfect vessel for a Phalaenopsis? Okay, turn the camera around, let's begin. Okay, let's look at what we're going to need. Here is a fresh new bag of sphagnum moss, which you can get from generally any garden centre or hardware store, but you can also get that online. And I've got some large orchid bark here, and my trusty Chinese scissors in case there's some dead roots to cut, which there will be, and some slow release fertilizer. First thing I'm going to do though is show you this plant. So this is the one I mentioned that I had bought 2 years ago actually, and has just been in the corner, and look, it literally just fell out, and oh, there's the plug that it was growing in. This is a very peaty mix, and that is quite a degraded mix, which is perhaps why our orchid is not in the best of health. This always looks like a pot that you get a toilet brush in, so I'm not a fan of this. This I will wash and take to the op shop. Now, let's just have a look at our plant. So we have got a couple of roots that are okay. This one. So quite a lot of dead root here. Now, with these aerial roots, with Phalaenopsis, it really isn't life and death if you pot it in the medium. And in fact, I'm going to pot this one. It's just going to help me stabilize the plant. The other thing you might notice on this one is it's developing a keiki. Now, this might well be because the plant's perhaps not in the best of conditions, so it's kind of putting all its energy into one last hurrah to procreate. So I'm going to leave this on. You can see how green the stem is. This stem is still feeding this keiki. When the keiki starts to develop roots, I'll take this off and pot it up and then cut off the dead flower spike. But in the meantime, though, I'm going to leave this. So let's just trim off some of these, well, in fact, all of these dead roots. We don't want those merrily decomposing in our mix. Okay, that's what we're left with. Not bad. That's enough to anchor the plant. Let's now pot it up. Now, what I'm going to use for this one is glass with sphagnum moss, and I'm going to be able to keep a good eye on the roots in this one. Let's open our moss. Right, so let's get some of this out. Okay, there we go. There is all our sphagnum moss. Now, moss straight out of the bag like this can be just a little hydrophobic. So I am just going to moisten all of this. It'll be a little easier to work with. And as I'm potting it in glass, I'm not going to be able to drench it once the plant is potted up. So I'm just going to go and moisten all this now. Okay, so there's our moss in water, absorbing, absorbing, absorbing. Give it a little prod and a little soak. And now I'm going to go and drain this so it's easy to use. There we go, drained. And you obviously have to squeeze it to drain it. So I'm just fluffing it up again because we don't want this to be too compacted around the orchid roots. So remember, epiphytes like a free draining, airy environment. There's lots of breeze and moisture passing across their roots. They don't like to be tightly compacted into any kind of potting medium. So there we go, nice and fluffy. Next up, our vessel. There we go, our charming glass vase. Let us just put some moss in there. Super duper. And I'm not pressing it down, keeping it quite light. Let's get some of our roots in there. Like that. I'm also, as you can see, putting that aerial root in. The world will not end. And then just let's pack around there, like that. And now our plant isn't that stable, so I am just going to stake it, and I'm going to attach the stake to that flower spike, which has got the keiki, to keep the plant upright and stable while it develops its wonderful new root system. There we go. And now I'm just going to add a little bit of slow release fertilizer. This one releases over 6 months, as you can see, and just a few little drops of the granules in there. And what I've also just noticed, which you might not be able to see, but can you see in there, I can see some mealybugs. So I'm just going to give this a bit of a spray. And I'm using Eco Pest Oil. You can see mealybug on the cover, which is useful. So we just want to get some into that leaf axis to make sure that those beasts are no more. There we go. And again, trying to avoid getting any liquid sitting in the crown of the orchid. Okay, now I'm not going to water this one as there's plenty of moisture in the sphagnum moss. I'm just going to keep my eye on that sphagnum moss, and when it starts to dry down sort of the top couple of inches, I'll then just gently moisten the surface just to keep that lower sphagnum moss moist and hopefully encourage our roots to thrive and prosper like its other cousin here, which does incredibly well for me and blooms every year. Okay, let's unearth it and just see what is going on in this pot. There we go. There's our sphagnum moss. So this is really, really healthy. So in comparison to that other one I just did, really fantastic. The moss might be a little compact, but you can see it's in wonderful, fresh, healthy condition. It's not decomposing. I'm just going to loosen it up a little bit. I'm going to leave, oh, it's actually quite compacted. There we go. Ah, we can see here where it was repotted. There's the original tube. Let's remove that. That's obviously older moss in the core there. And there's the plug, which you can see in there, the mossy plug that the plant came from. And this always feels like the strangest foam. Quite an unpleasant material. There we are. Anyway, let's remove all of that. Excellent. Okay, there's just a couple of roots to trim here. Otherwise, that's all looking quite healthy. Okay, let us pot this one up in our delicious antique French pot. And for this one, I'm going to use a generous mix of sphagnum moss and bark. So this is the other option I'm going to use. So sphagnum moss for moisture retention and aeration, and the bark again just helps aerate it and gives the roots something to cling on to. There we go. So we'll mix that up. In we go. In with our root system. Again, I'm not going to worry too much if I get any of the aerial roots in the mix. It is not going to hurt. And then we just fill in around with our very, very loose mix of sphagnum and bark. And I'm using dry moss in this instance because this is a pot with drainage. I can really, really drench this once I've finished potting the plant up. And that will get all the moss really, really wet. There we are, fantastic. I'll just go and give this a good drenching and come back. So there we are, plant lovers. Everything repotted. I have got one in a mix of sphagnum and medium bark, and I have one potted in 100% sphagnum and in a glass vessel with no drainage, which I know is counterintuitive, but as this one proves, can and does work for me. Totally up to you, wherever you're growing Phalaenopsis in the world, whatever works for you. There are so many ways to pot them. So these are the ways that I have chosen. Certainly not the only way or necessarily the best or the right way. But many thanks for watching. I hope my little phal adventure has been interesting for you, and you might be going, Matthew, I just want to see what happens with these. We will follow the trajectory, particularly this one, which I just repotted, which wasn't in the healthiest of conditions. So we will just keep our eye on that and see what's going on with its root development and whether it decides to flower for me, and also how that keiki progresses when it gets some roots and I can pot it up. This had a beautiful coloured flower, so I am really keen for it to survive, or its progeny. Many thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you next week. I post every Friday, so if this amateur ramble has been of any interest, do hit subscribe. And I hope wherever you are, your orchids are as happy and content as can be, and I look forward to seeing you next week.